All right. Okay. So I am Paul Ship with Kansas Legal Services. Kansas Legal Services is a not-for-profit law firm, and what we do is we provide lawyers to individuals who cannot otherwise afford an attorney. We're partnering with the Habitat for Humanity and providing an education presentation on landlord-tenant issues, and our goal is to try to make it easier and better for tenants and landlords to communicate with each other and get things done so that there's a good relationship. There is a little bit of a bent toward tenants because we represent tenants, and we want to educate them with regard to what their rights are. But at the same time, landlords should be able to walk away with some good, helpful information. Kansas Legal Services has been around quite a long time. We have offices that serve every county in the state. And our Seneca office currently serves the Atchison area. At our previous meeting, when I came out here, we talked a lot about delivery of the rental unit and the relationship between the landlord and tenant at the very beginning, and why it's really important for the tenant to not make a bad choice in renting from a landlord that they're going to regret renting from. And it's because an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And we're going to continue that discussion today, assuming that the tenant and the landlord are satisfied at the beginning of the rental relationship, and they're going to begin this relationship together so that they can have the tenant move in and things are going to go well. And so one of the most important things that tenants and landlords need to do is communicate with each other. And so the purpose of this discussion is, my goal is to motivate tenants and landlords to have good communication with each other, because that's really where a big breakdown happens between landlords and tenants, is when they don't communicate with each other. And so, and too often landlords and tenants have this notion that there are evil landlords and there are abused tenants, and the reality is there are bad landlords and there are bad tenants, and there are good tenants and bad landlords, and bad, landlords and good tenants. It goes back and forth. And so I am not of the notion that all landlords should be vilified and said they're bad people. And there are probably just as many bad tenants as there are landlords. We want to avoid this notion when we're talking about having a good relationship between landlords and tenants. And so we want to have cooperation. And so the most important thing that you need to understand as a tenant or a landlord is the purpose of the maintenance request. The maintenance request is the landlord and the tenant's first line of communication. And if you don't have good communication, then you're going to have problems with your rental. You're going to have problems with that relationship. With a maintenance request, we're going to talk a little bit about documentation and throughout this, and then the other part of this is the purpose of the maintenance request is protection. It not only protects the tenant, it also protects the landlord. Because if you don't maintain a rental, then the rental falls apart. And that's what you want to avoid. Some landlords, and this is probably the best provision I've seen in any rental agreement between a landlord and a tenant, some landlords have this sort of provision in their rental agreement. If you're a landlord and you don't have this in your rental agreement, you might think about having it. If your landlord does not have it in the rental agreement, the principles that are outlined in this paragraph is something that you should know as a tenant. It's a good idea for the tenant to maintain the rental unit in a clean, neat, and undamaged, unaltered condition. You need to make sure you're taking your trash out and that you're cleaning your rental unit and you're taking care of it. And if there's any repairs that are needed to the rental unit, then you need to notify the landlord so the landlord can take care of it. Because if you don't do that, it's going to cause problems. And some of those problems can get pretty big. And I've had a few cases actually in the last couple of years. I had one last year that really kind of blew my mind. And maybe if I remember to share it, I will. But when you're doing a maintenance request, it is really smart for the landlord to require that it be in writing. This particular landlord even says in here that if it's not put in writing, then you may as well assume I'm going to forget, because if you tell me orally, I'm not going to remember and it's not effective. And so make absolutely certain that you put it in writing. And so when you do a maintenance request, and I just call it an MR, and there's a pun there, but what does a good maintenance request look like? okay? And the answer to what does a good maintenance request look like is you'll know it when you see it, because you just have to do it. And then the other issue with maintenance requests is, do you do them now or do you do them later? And my notion of doing them now or later is that you do them immediately. Don't waste time and don't wait to do a maintenance request. And if anyone has any thoughts on why you'd rather do it now than later, I welcome them. If not, maybe I'll bring some up. Why would you want to do a maintenance request like right now?
So it doesn't get worse.
It doesn't get worse. That's right. One of my attorneys in one of my offices was advising a client, and he came to me and he said, well, our clients had really small children, and they pretty much put those little things on the door handles for the sink so the kids couldn't get under there. And it's been that way since they lived there for 2 years, and they didn't realize there was a leak in the sink. And when they pulled it open, it was full of mold, and the ground was rotted, and the cabinet was rotted, and they want to know, are they liable for it? And the answer was, yep. And why is that? Because if you don't put your repairs requests in, you're not protecting the landlord's investment, and it's your fault. And so, yes, do them now, don't wait. And make sure that you put it in writing, like actually write it down, and document it. And if you don't put it in writing, it doesn't happen. The reason why you want to put it in writing is because later, if there's an issue about that, you've got some proof. Okay, let's pretend like the tenant in the one situation where the sink was leaking and it was causing damage to the cabinet. If the tenant put that in writing and said, hey, to the landlord, I need you to fix this. If the landlord never fixed it and the cabinet got damaged, now whose fault is it? It's the landlord's fault, because they failed to maintain the rental unit. And if there's any litigation, then you've got proof in a court of law, which turns into evidence in a court hearing, because that particular maintenance request might put a little sticker on it, and it becomes a document, and and if I'm the lawyer and I've got the tenant sitting in the witness stand, and I'm like, okay, your landlord's trying to charge you to fix for the repair of this rotted sink. Did you present them with a maintenance request? Okay, yes. Can I hand you what's been marked exhibit number A? Can you identify what that is? Well, that was my maintenance request. Well, when did you give it to him? I gave it to him in January. Did the landlord ever fix it? Well, yeah, they got to it finally in November, and now that I'm moving out in December, he wants me to pay for the repairs. Do you think that's fair? I don't need to explain why it's not fair, right? Because it's pretty obvious, but those maintenance requests could become evidence in a trial at a later date. Hopefully it never will, because the purpose of that maintenance request is to notify the landlord of a problem so that the landlord is going to fix it. And so one of my rule of thumbs with maintenance requests, because I'm not a fan of a maintenance request that's just a big old laundry list of items. I like a maintenance request that is going to give the landlord one thing to focus on. And so that means if you have 5 issues, then you have 5 maintenance requests. If you have 3 issues, then you have 3 maintenance requests. I don't really like the laundry list, because then the landlord can tick them off, one at a time. And so focus on one thing at a time. And when you're doing a maintenance request, you want it to be concise. And you want to put it in writing, and you want to talk about one problem, and you want to document it and explain it good enough for the landlord to understand what's going on. The tenant might want to have additional documentation or evidence that they keep for themselves, especially if they worry that the landlord may be unresponsive to the maintenance request. Things like that might be a friend come over and look at it with you and give you some ideas. Maybe some extra photographs that are in addition to, what it is that you submit to the landlord. But when you give the information to the landlord, you need to give the landlord enough information to know exactly what the problem is so that they can fix it. You should also put in your maintenance request all your contact information, because if the landlord has questions and wants to talk to you, it's really important that you communicate with them. So don't be afraid to give them all of this stuff, including your work phone number, because they might need to call you and ask you additional questions. And so, yeah, actually, I'm in a rental right now, and last month a friend came over and the heat turned off, and then we noticed that something was running, and we were like, what is that? I'm like, it sounds like it's running. And we opened up the closet where the unit was, and my friend was like, that's the air conditioner unit running. I'm like, why in the heck is the air conditioner running? And so then he touched one of the metal pipes, and he's like, that's where the freon or something like the cold air, there's something outside that turns, see how much I know about this stuff, and it blows air, and then there's this metal pipe that comes in, that goes in there, and he touched it, and he's like, ow, that's really hot. And then there was something dripping down from it, and he's like, you're probably losing freon. And I'm like, summer's coming, I don't want to have any air conditioning. And so, you know, the next day I did a maintenance request for the landlord, and I just kind of explained what happened, you know, and I took some photographs, you know, and then I sent a maintenance request, and, you know, and so far my AC works, but, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but the landlord has not looked at it that I know of yet. But a good maintenance request will also notify the landlord whether the tenant wants to be present, okay? Now, while it is true that the tenant can say to the landlord, I'd like to be present, I would caution tenants to not be jerks, okay? Your landlord, they're not interested in stealing your stuff and stuff. If they do, then buy yourself a camera or something. But don't be the tenant that makes it impossible for your landlord to fix the problem because you can't be there when it's convenient for you. Your landlord has an investment to protect, and you want to make sure that your AC is working per se, or your heat's working per se, or hot water heater. And if you can't be there, don't be the obstructionist. It's still important for you to communicate and cooperate with your landlord. Sometimes I get calls from clients and tenants, and it's just obvious to me that the reason why it can't get fixed is because they're being a jerk to the landlord. And I'm not afraid to say to the tenant, look, if you're making it impossible for the landlord to fix the problem, then you're part of the problem. And so you can't, so it's okay to tell the landlord that you would prefer to be there, and that's fine, but don't make it so that it's wholly convenient for you and not convenient for the landlord, because otherwise the problem is never going to get fixed, because you're the problem that's keeping it from getting fixed. The other important thing to remember about a maintenance request is that it's easy to produce. All too often, tenants don't make the maintenance request in the first place. And sometimes they make the maintenance request, but they don't keep a copy of it, and they don't document. I mean, with these things called smartphones nowadays, there's no reason why you can't do something like Google Docs or Google Photo. I mean, for my rentals that I've ever had, I opened up my Google account and I call it the name of the rental, you know, and then every time I see a problem or something, I take a picture and I just save it to the folder. And if I'm doing a maintenance request, I do similar things. But you want to make sure that you are able to easily reproduce it. Why is that? Because if you ever end up in a courtroom, then you want to be able to say, here's all my maintenance requests. And it's really that simple. So examples of maintenance requests, and there's a whole laundry list here. And sometimes you may not think that some of these things are a big deal, but they can become a big deal. You know, the wobbly ceiling fan might rip a hole in your sheetrock. You know, the leaky faucet might turn into a rotted floor, a subfloor. You know, and I've got some ideas here. These are actual pictures from actual cases that I actually litigated. And so, like in this particular situation, if you look very carefully, you will see the cabinets are not being held on the wall very well, and so the tenant took a stick and stuck it there. Now I have a lot of questions about this rental unit, period, if you look at the conditions of the walls. But the tenant had put that there, and when I met with this particular client, I was like, well, did you tell the landlord about it? And they said no, and I'm like, well, there's one problem right there. But what happened was the cabinet came off the wall and it broke every dish that was in it. I wouldn't have put my dishes in that cabinet. I would not have done that. But that would be a good reason for a maintenance request. Another example is rodents, ants. I've had bats, but like in this particular situation, the tenant had an ant problem. I'll show the video in a minute just because it's kind of fun to watch. But I mean, even I have been a homeowner. I've owned a couple of homes in my lifetime. Sometimes in the spring, the ants come back, and so you need a treat. And so I knew every spring in my second home that I owned, I was always outside the front window by the kitchen because the ants love the kitchen, and I was treating it outside and I was treating it inside. And if you have an ant problem, then you need to tell the landlord. And so like here's the video that was going on.
Okay, that was just sat down there for about 15 minutes. because I had to go in, do an errand.
She
Nothing
doesn't
in the cup. It's just a coffee cup.
Right, and that in that particular case with the ants, that tenant actually got a check from the landlord at the end of the lawsuit because there were multiple requests for the landlord to treat, and they just didn't do it. And it came to it got so bad that the tenant couldn't live there anymore. And she told the landlord where to stick it. And then the landlord sued her for the following month's rent. And not only did the landlord not get his following month's rent, he had to refund her a couple months' rent and write her a check. And so, warning to landlords, if you get a maintenance request in situations that are like this, then don't wait on them. And if you're a tenant, don't wait either, because an ant problem can quickly get out of control. And so can a mouse problem, so can a bat problem, so can a leaky faucet problem, so can gutters that aren't right. It can destroy a foundation of a home, and then you're going to have mold in your basement, and the grade on the foundation isn't right, and so that could be a maintenance request. This is a case where I really didn't like these countertops in this case, because that's a countertop and they got cracked, and when the tenant moved in they were cracked. And this is actually a really sad case, but that's how they looked when the tenant moved in. This right here, it's the countertop, and the tenant was complaining because the landlord was charging them for the cracked countertop, and that goes back to the very beginning when they first moved to the rental unit, when you should fill out the condition of the rental unit, and they never did it. And the tenant's position was we shouldn't have to pay for that because that's how it was when we got there. And they should have done a maintenance request when they first moved in, and they never did. And they ended up paying for that countertop. And the same thing was true with the floor. There's a tiled floor, and when they moved in, the tile floor was cracked. And then, a couple weeks later, after walking across the cracked tile floor, and they had a couple toddlers who were playing with their plastic lawnmowers and the rolling toys and playing on the floor, they didn't tell the landlord, this tile is cracked, it needs to be fixed. And then next thing you know, the tile fully cracked and the tile slid off, and they never did a maintenance request. And as a result of that, the tenant ended up paying the landlord to replace the tiles, because the tenant was basically accused of breaking the tile when the tenant had not. I've seen the cracked bathtub before, which is a really big deal. Why is that a big deal? I see the landlord here. Why is that a big deal?
Down below.
Right, down below. Where's that water going? It's going into the subfloor, and it's going to rot that stuff out. If you have a tenant below you or whatever, it's going to rot the subfloor on all around the tub. And so you need to fix that. Now that was an actual hot water heater. Yep. And that was an interesting case. But if you have a hot water heater that looks like that, you might want to tell the landlord that or if let's say that your hot water isn't very plentiful, that can be a symptom that your hot water heater needs to be drained and the rocks cleared out of it. There are parts of Kansas where the water is hard as what. And if you don't maintain your hot water heater, then your hot water heater is going to die on you. And that's kind of what happened here. And so you might sometimes need to do a maintenance request for the hot water heater. And so it's not a life-threatening situation if you run out of hot water 10 minutes after shower, and it's probably not a good enough problem for you to terminate your rental agreement, but you should still do a maintenance request for it, because you don't want to have that, completely go down, on you in a bad way. But maintenance requests, they don't have to take a particular form. Some landlords are okay with an email. Some landlords are okay with like they might have a special portal. I don't know if that landlords in Atchison are doing that. My guess is the bigger corporate landlords might. Some landlords have like a portal where you pay your rent, and then they have like a little tab for doing maintenance requests, and I saw a head nod in the room. Those are okay. But if your landlord has a form or a procedure for doing a maintenance request, then use it. It's okay to use the landlord's form. I'm not a form snob. I'm not saying that my form is better than anyone else's form. But I will still tell you that the principles of good maintenance requests are all the things that I said. You're going to have concise documentation. You're going to have good contact information. You're going to tell the landlord whether you want to be there, and you're going to easily reproduce it. And you're going to have information in addition to whatever it is that you put in the maintenance request in case you need it for later to more fully explain what's going on. And if the landlord has a form, then use the landlord's form. If the landlord's form does not provide the space for you to do things like put, I would like to be present, then write it in there or say that. If the landlord doesn't have a place to put the information for you to be contacted at, don't be afraid to add that in there. And so if your landlord does not have a form, and I think that this presentation will be linked and anyone on the web can look at it. If you click the link, it'll open up a suggested form. And so I'll probably go ahead and just look at that now. But this is, I'll make it bigger. No, I don't want to have to re-sign in. I apologize. Okay, there we go. And it looks like someone else is looking at it, which is great. Soon you just make it a little bit larger. And so if you look at the maintenance request, you'll see how you're sending it to the landlord, you're saying who it's from, and then the little blurb I put there just to help the tenant describe the problem in detail. It should be described good enough for the landlord to understand it. Attach pictures or other supporting materials only if the information will help the landlord understand the problem. You might explain how it's affecting you or other residents. I also have a maintenance request for a common area, because sometimes you might live in a building and maybe you notice the carpeting on the stairs on the way up needs to be fixed. It's okay to do a maintenance request for the common area or the dumpster or the parking lot. But generally, most tenants are going to be doing, a maintenance request for their living area. And then if you don't have enough space, then just put additional information. And if you want, you can take that that document and you can make extra copies, or whatever you like. And so then the most important thing is send it to the landlord. Okay, I had one group. It was in Manhattan, and they were just hell-bent on everything must be texted. And I'm like, well then, fill it out and take a picture and text the picture. But you need to send the information. If your landlord doesn't like that, then you should do it the way that your landlord does. But hand delivery, email, photograph, texting, as long as you document it, and that's what's most important. And so here comes the fun part, because I think sometimes tenants have unrealistic expectations of landlords, because the question that I get the most often is, well, how long does the landlord have to fix it? And the answer is when the landlord gets to it. Okay? But some landlords are like, wow, they show up in the same freaking day and they get it done. And that's really great. And that is what we all want, right? Like, my toilet doesn't flush right, and there's a problem, and the landlord's handyman shows up, 2 hours later and fixes it. You're like, wow, my garbage disposal stopped spinning. I want it fixed. And the landlord sends one by the end of the day. That's terrific. That's what you want. Not all landlords are like that. Some landlords might be a little bit overextended, and procrastination. They might take a little bit longer than you want them to. Unfortunately, that's not illegal. Because sometimes landlords have priorities. Maybe the property down the street got flooded, and there's 10 people who don't have nowhere to sleep that night, and fixing your garbage disposal or your washing machine or your hot water heater that's not working as efficiently, they might get to that in a couple weeks, but that really is not illegal, because the landlord is going to get to it when they can get to it. And so sometimes, unfortunately, this is where the tenant is. You're just left waiting and waiting and waiting. Okay, so going back to what we're talking about here, we're talking about the notion of communication between you and the landlord. Okay, if this is happening, you might have a bad landlord. Okay, but you still need to make the effort to communicate with the landlord and tell the landlord what your needs are. And so document that you told the landlord that you have a problem. If a month goes by and the issue that you're having is affecting your ability to reside in a rental property, then there's a whole nother presentation that I give called Do I Stay or Do I Go? And there's like a little song, if anyone remembers the song, Do I Stay or Do I Go? You know it, I see someone giggling. Right, And so, but there's a whole nother presentation about that. But if you're in one of those tenants where you are not happy with it and it's affecting the value of your rental, then when it comes time to pay rent the next month, complain about it. Unfortunately, you're not going to like this answer either, even though you didn't ask the question. Do you have to pay next month's rent? The answer is yes. You have to pay your rent. Even if the landlord did not fix the not so efficient hot water heater, you cannot withhold your rent and expect that the landlord's not going to evict you. You have to pay your rent. But when you go in to pay your rent, say at $650, when you write that check or give the landlord the cash for the rent, complain. Don't be afraid to say to the landlord, I gave you a maintenance request and I'm not happy. My AC is not working. I've been without AC for 2 freaking weeks and I have to pay this whole month's rent. And I think you should discount it, but I have to pay it anyway. And document it and give it to them. And so if you want a form for paying your rent under protest, you can do that. There are some municipalities and counties where they have a mechanism in place and you don't have to pay your landlord. You can maybe pay the local authority. And I think there might be some of that going on in Atchison, but they haven't set it up correctly. But if that's not set up, there's a form for that. And so if you go to the presentation online and you click that, you'll see that I have a payment of rent under protest, and this is just kind of like a guided document. You'll notice it kind of looks like the other. You're going to put your name, address, and phone number, but you know you're going to say to the landlord, on this date, on this 25th day of May 2022, I timely paid my rent in full under protest by giving you blank dollars. Even though I paid the full month's rent, I do so under protest, blah, blah, blah. And so if a lawsuit is filed, I'll seek a refund of the money that I paid you. But that's proof that you complain. There's nothing more frustrating to me than when a tenant asks me to represent them in court, and then we do go to court, and then the landlord's testimony is they never complained about anything. They never gave me a maintenance request. This is the first I've heard of this complaint. And so that is what you want to avoid. And so the other thing that you can do, no, I don't want to open that. I want to go back to full screen. Okay, there we go. Is if you don't pay your rent under protest, there's this other thing called the 1430-day notice, which is not a maintenance request. And all too often, tenants get them confused. And they think, oh, my hot water heater's not working as efficiently, or there's something wrong with my front door, or, you know, there's a leaky faucet. That's not when you give a 1430-day notice. You give a 1430-day notice when you're at the end of your rope and you're sick and tired of waiting and you want to move out. Okay? Because it's okay if the dripping faucet in the kitchen is fixed, 4 or 5 weeks later. You're not going to die from that, okay? That's what you use a maintenance request for. You know, but if 3 weeks go by and you don't have any heat, or 3 weeks goes by and you don't have any AC and it's 105 degrees outside and you can't live there anymore, now you're looking at maybe doing this thing called a 1430-day notice. And the purpose of a 1430-day notice is to politely tell your landlord where to stick it, because you're moving out. If you don't fix it, I'm gone. That's not a maintenance request, and that's a whole different presentation. That is a really a different presentation. And so, if I'm going back to the most important thing about the maintenance request, I'm going to go back to that slide about the evil landlord and the abused tenant. You have to think about the purpose of the maintenance request is communication, and cooperation. Because if the landlord and the tenant are not communicating and cooperating, it's going to be obvious that the rental unit's going to go to crack. And the landlord's going to lose their investment, and the tenant is not going to have safe housing. And so in order to maintain that safe housing, the tenant has to communicate. And we want responsive landlords that act like the Speedy Gonzalez character. It may be a little bit of procrastination, but we don't want them to. We don't want the landlord to make us be waiting like a skeleton over here. And so if anyone has any questions or comments, I welcome them. I will make certain, if it's not already done, to put links in the discussion section for things like, a suggested maintenance request that I have, a suggested payment of rent under protest, a suggested 14 30-day notice, which is a whole nother discussion, and then a future topic, if you're interested, would be the 14 30-day notice, and how when you are this guy or person with your landlord, the way that you diplomatically, legally, and properly tell your landlord you're sick and tired of waiting and you want to get out. And so that'll be a future discussion. So were there any questions online? None. That's crazy. That's good though. Anyone in the room have any thoughts or ideas? Anyone want to share a war story? You got a nodding head now. I like war stories.
Say if the tenant finds one roach in your house.
Uh-huh.
Like, how do you determine if it's a big deal or not? Like, should they hire an exterminator just for one roach?
Well, I mean, I'm a homeowner in the past, and I remember one time seeing a roach, and I think that a good landlord and a good tenant would do what any good homeowner would do. If you saw a roach in your home, you would be like, oh my God, where'd it come from, right? Like, where'd it come from? You're going to get on your hands and knees, you're going to investigate. Maybe it's just some stray, but maybe there's a roach motel on the wall somewhere. And so I would want to get to the bottom of it because, if you see one roach, you might have 5,000 if you're not careful. But if you discover it's really not a big deal, it's not a big deal. And so if I found a roach, I'd probably want to treat it. Just treat for, prophylactic reasons, preventative reasons. But, some tenants can overreact about there being a roach, I remember one time I had a rental and I saw a roach, and then a couple weeks later I saw another roach, and then a couple weeks later I saw another roach. I remember when I saw the first roach, and I immediately took a picture and I sent a maintenance request to the landlord, and I said, I saw a roach. You need to look into it. It was a multi-unit structure. It was like an old house, and so it was like this giant mansion, and the apartments were beautiful. But I had a feeling that one of the tenants in the basement was a hoarder and was nasty and never cleaned up after themselves. And I remember in the second maintenance request I sent to the landlord, and I reminded the landlord exactly what is on the slide right here. I said to the landlord in the maintenance request, I am talking to you because I'm communicating with you because you need to protect your investment, because if that bitch that lives downstairs is hoarding and has food and it's just nasty, your one tenant's going to destroy the whole building. So you need to get in there and look at it, because I'm getting roaches from someone else's apartment. That's a big deal. And so I think every situation is different. And so you really need to evaluate it, and everyone needs to be reasonable and talk to each other. Because the last thing, a landlord wants to hear is the tenant accusing the landlord of being, you creep, you don't even care. Hopefully the tenant's wrong, and hopefully the landlord will react and do what's appropriate instead of just blowing it off. Because if you have a roach or a mouse or a bat in your rental, it's probably a good idea to take care of it. And the tenant will appreciate that you're being responsive instead of blowing it off. Because otherwise this will happen. Because that's what you want to avoid. That's a good question.
What would you recommend? I have a client. They live in like a duplex type place.
Mm-hmm.
They lived there for 2 weeks, and they had seen a mouse. She reached out to her landlord. He just told her, go buy some glue traps, put them out. In that meantime, she has now caught 8 other mice.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't want to call an exterminator because it's just going to cost too much for him to call an exterminator.
Okay.
What would you recommend? Who's really
Well,
responsible? Because,
The tenant,
like I said, she's been there for 2 weeks. weeks.
Yeah, the tenant, and so the tenant in that particular situation has to make a decision, okay? And so they're going to do a maintenance request, period. Just do one, because you want to document and count the mice. Saw another one, saw another one, saw another one, saw another one. Maybe you're supplementing the maintenance request. But there's going to come a point, and this is a different presentation, do I stay or do I go? I mean, if you have that many mice going on, you could have other things happening that might materially affect the health or safety of the tenant. Do you
Well,
see what
her
I mean?
biggest fear is if she was to go, that's going to count against her because she signed a lease.
Well,
so
she
she'd
could.
be breaking lease, and then it would go on her references.
It could, and so, but like I said, that is a more complicated discussion because that's what the 14 30-day notice discussion, and do I stay or do I go? And you know, a lot of low-income people get in a bind because they want to stay because they can't afford to go. And so that's why it's important for that tenant to make sure they complain and complain a lot. And so maintenance request, maintenance request, maintenance request. 14 30-day notice. If they're not in a position to get up and leave and they're not in a position to do a 14 30-day notice, then they should be doing the, hey landlord, I'm giving you my $500 this month, but now I'm up to 25 mice.
Now here's my question.
And that's all they can do. They still have to pay the full month's rent. Now, there is this thing called an offensive legal action, and they can call our 800 number and ask for help and advice on that. And there's in some of our offices, we will, depending upon the facts, we might represent the tenant and bring an offensive action to force the landlord to fix the problem. Unfortunately, if you're dealing with a situation like that, it's probably smart to get code services involved, and anywhere that you live, especially in any municipality in the state of Kansas, they're probably going to have building and housing codes that address things like rodents, and the landlord's probably going to get a building and housing code violation, which will usually light a fire under them. But those situations are toxic because what you're describing to me is a landlord that is not responsive or appreciative. The landlord obviously doesn't have any respect for or appreciation for his investment.
Well, my problem
Which is sad.
The tenant does not pay the rent.
Uh-huh.
They're in a program, and the program pays the rent.
The Section 8 voucher rent.
Kind of. Yes.
Right, if they're in a Section 8 voucher type thing or a VA benefits type thing, they can report the issue to the voucher program, and they can still pay their rent under protest. One time I had a case, it was in Manhattan, where the local housing authority was paying quite a few $100s for the tenant, and the tenant was paying a very little bit. And when the lawsuit got going, I joined the housing authority in the lawsuit and basically asked the court to enter an order to refund the subsidized portion of the rent to the housing authority as well. And so the good news about those housing vouchers is they're portable, so they can discuss the issue with the housing authority that's giving them that voucher, no matter what kind it is, and say, this is the problem, it's untenable, I can't live there. They can ask the housing authority to give them another housing quality review and say, we're not, because the housing authority should not be paying a subsidy in a place that's not habitable, and a rodent problem makes it uninhabitable. And so the housing authority can say, we're going to terminate, but the tenant should not be penalized for doing the right thing, and that voucher should be fully portable to go to somewhere else. And so again, communicate. And so that kind of tenant should not just communicate with the landlord, they should also communicate with the folks giving them the voucher. And then they coordinate and work together, and maybe the tenant says, I'm turning into a rental agreement with the blessing of the voucher people, and then they can take it somewhere else. Sometimes people draw a box or a circle around themselves and they're like, I can't get out of this. It's like, no, you can. Communicate, talk, and be factual. Don't exaggerate, right? Good question. Any other questions? If not, if you're interested, we'll do the 14:30 notice on another day.